So good afternoon. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the fifth and final event in the 2015-16 season of the Provost Forums on the Public University and the Social Good. And we want to acknowledge that we are in the presence of the Provost, Ken Burtis. Today we're privileged to have as our guest lecturers Cristina Gonzalez, Professor of Education and Spanish here at UC Davis, and Liliana Pedraja, Professor of Business Administration at the University of Tarpaca in Chile, and Director of its Center for Regional Research. Before we introduce her, I have some quick announcements. First, I want to express my gratitude to all who have made this event possible. In particular, I want to thank the Provost Forum Steering Committee, led by Martin Kenny, Professor of Human and Community Development. Professor Kenny, I should slow down, will also serve as moderator of today's event. My gratitude, as always, to the three campus units that have joined the Office of the Provost to co-sponsor this lecture: the Office of the Chancellor, Community and Regional Development Program, the School of Education, as well as Chile's National Committee on Scientific and Technological Research. As I've said, this is the final event of the current season, but have no fear, the Provost Forums will begin its 2016-17 season early on Wednesday, September 21st. On that date, our distinguished speaker will be Martha Nussbaum, the prominent American philosopher and Ernst Freud Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics at the University of Chicago. Program details will be circulated later in the summer. To find information on any of our forums, as well as videos of all of our past events, please visit the series website at provostforums.ucdavis.edu. Finally, there will be a question and answer period after today's presentation, and then a reception on the patio. You're all invited, indeed encouraged, to stay for the Q&A period and, of course, the reception. Before I yield the podium to Professor Kenny, who will properly introduce our speakers, I want to take the opportunity to offer a brief pre-introductory comment. Today's presentation gives us an opportunity that we've had only twice before in the preceding 26 forums. I'm speaking of the opportunity to examine more than a passing way the relationship between higher education and the social good in a country other than our own. Way back in the spring of 2013, Carlos de Brito Cruz spoke to us on the topic, Challenges and Opportunities for Public Research Universities in Brazil. And Alan Goodman spoke on the topic, From Mandalay to Memorial Union, How Public Universities Keep Dreams Alive. Today, we will hear about what our speakers call the Chilean higher education experiment and its discontents. To be sure, the forum's series is designed to focus on public higher education in the United States, and we've had no shortage of worthy and even urgent topics to address without looking beyond our borders. But it is immensely valuable for us to take some time, now and again, to consider higher education in other countries, both the realities and the ideas behind them. This is especially true when, as in today's forum, the discussion will directly resonate with the leading concern of our own U.S. public universities. I'm speaking of the idea of sharply raising tuition as a solution for institutional budget pressures. Indeed, on my own visits to Chile, I learned that Chilean student groups were among the first to articulate arguments against the privatization of higher education. In Plato's account in the Republic, Socrates provided the rationale for today's forum when he asserted the value of dialectic as a means of attaining the highest understanding. One reaches that high understanding when one considers conflicting ideas side by side. In this lecture series, it's our habit to foster this sort of dialectical process on a wide range of questions about the public university. But how can the process be adequate if it excludes ideas from other countries? To view the realities of higher education in other countries as mostly incomparable to our American situation is one way we can fall into the trap of simplistic American exceptionalism. To view ideas shaping higher education in other countries as, on the whole, less valuable than our own ideas is but another side of the same exceptionalist coin. To their credit, both Professors Gonzalez and Pedraja will focus on both the situation in Chile and its applicability to our situation here in the United States. I don't may not even have needed to make so strong a case for today's forum, but I want to add that attending to international perspectives can be both liberating and empowering. For learning about the different features of higher education in Chile and the United States, to take but one example, can dramatically highlight the fact that there's nothing natural or inevitable or unequivocally superior about our ways of doing things. Learning about different ideas that shape higher education in another country can also embolden us to think and plan in new and creative ways. We see that other worthy thinkers have come up with ideas different from our own, or in some cases that they hold transformative ideas that we already share, but for one reason or another have refrained from expressing. It's with anticipation of both intellectual liberation and empowerment that I welcome our two speakers and thank them for being here to share with us their knowledge and wisdom. And now, Professor Kenny.
Thank you, Acting Chancellor Hexter. It's a little bit hard to top that introduction, so I will just say we're again delighted to have our own Cristina Gonzalez, who's a professor of education and Spanish at UC Davis, and an affiliate of the Center for Studies in Higher Education, and Liliana Pedraja, a professor of business administration at the University of Tarpaca, Chile, to speak with us about privatization and access, the Chilean higher education experiment, its discontents. As you know, Professor Gonzalez is a globally renowned scholar on issues regarding higher education policy, history, and governance. She authored a wonderful book on the history and current state of the University of California entitled Clark Kerr's University of California, Leadership, Diversity, Planning in Higher Education. Dr. Pedraja is the director of the Center for Regional Research and the author of numerous publications on academic leadership and strategic planning, as well as higher education in Chile. As Acting Chancellor Hexter already said, Chile was an early experimenter in the privatization of higher education, public higher education, and more recently has been the site of a powerful mass social reaction against that privatization. So I think Professor Gonzalez and Pedraja's presentation will help us understand the Chilean experience and how some of the lessons may be applicable to the funding and tuition-related problems our public universities are experiencing. Professors Gonzalez and Pedraja will speak for about 50 minutes, after which we will open the floor for questions. So without any further ado, I turn the floor over to Professor Gonzalez, who's going to, I guess, introduce Professor Pedraja again, or or will you both step up here and...
Thank you very much. Let me get my notes first. Okay. Thank you so much, Martin, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Cristina Gonzalez, and Liliana is sitting there. Liliana and I would like to thank Chancellor Hexter and the members of the advisory committee for the lecture series, for inviting us to this series. It's a big honor and a pleasure to participate. This presentation is going to be slightly different from the previous ones, at least in two respects. First, it's going to have a Spanish accent, literally and metaphorically. And then the previous presenters were people who had dedicated their careers to study higher education for the most part. In our case, both Liliana and I come to higher education from different fields. So we are relatively newcomers in this field. So I'm going to say a few things about Liliana's career and then about my own to explain what I'm indicating here. Her original field is business administration, and she has a PhD in that field. But then she got a second PhD more recently in higher education. And in fact, I was a member of the dissertation committee that was at the Catholic University in Chile. She has many publications, many grants from CONICYT, which is the NSF of Chile. And within higher education, she focuses on issues of academic leadership, of strategic planning, and also higher education in Chile, what's happening today. So that's her profile. I come from an even more distant field, which is the Spanish Middle Ages. That's pretty distant. So I'm a professor in the Spanish department, but because I was an administrator for a long time, I developed an interest in higher education issues. And I started to write about this and eventually to teach. And I have been doing this for the last 10, 15 years. Within higher education, what I do is also about academic leadership, also diversity issues, and history of higher education in the US, but also in other countries, including Chile. So you can see that there is a fair amount of overlap in what we do. We met a few years ago when she came to the Davis campus for a brief visit, and then I went to her campus at the University of Tarpaca, and with all these comings and goings, we got the idea of writing an article together about privatization and access in Chile and the United States. And we did. We wrote the article. Actually, it has come out at Berkeley, at the Center for Studies in Higher Education already. This article is not a point-by-point comparison between Chile and the US. It assumes that this is an American audience who knows a great deal about American higher education. So what we do is to highlight a few things in the history of Chilean higher education that we think are of interest to an American audience, because there are parallels or contrasts or whatever. And so that's what we did in that article. And this presentation is based on that article. So the article is about the US and Chile. Let me say a few things about the US, what's happening in the US right now in higher education. There are many things happening, actually. A very interesting development is the fact that President Obama has announced a plan to make community college free of charge. His reasoning is that today people need more levels of education than before. So if for a certain position 20 or 30 years ago a high school diploma was enough, today you probably need at least 2 additional years of training. And his reasoning is if high school was free 20 or 30 years ago, these 2 years, additional 2 years should be free now. It is not clear how this is going to be implemented. At the federal level, it's not going to be easy. However, at the state level, city level, even some individual institutions are beginning to move in that direction. So something is happening. While he was doing this, the First Lady was going around the country talking to young people and encouraging them to go for some sort of post-secondary education. So this was a well-coordinated plan. Together with that, he came up with another plan or idea, which is different, but I think is connected, which is to put more controls, more limitations on the for-profits. You know that there are many for-profit universities in this country. Some of them are fine, but many are having some difficulties, and the quality is questionable. They are expensive. The students cannot get jobs, then they cannot repay the loans. There are many problems. And he wants to put some controls there to prevent this from happening. And I assume to recover some public funds too, because there is public money going to the for-profits as well. So you can see that his approach is twofold. The free community college on the one hand, and let's reduce the for-profits on the other, okay? The presidential campaign, as you know, now has higher education as one of the topics of discussion. And the Democratic candidates have ideas and proposals about this. Bernie Sanders is talking not about 2 years of college, but 4 years of college free of charge. Hillary Clinton has a slightly different idea, which is to reduce or eliminate the loans, in some cases, student debt. Different approaches, but the idea is the same, and it is that in this highly privatized system, students cannot pay those prices and they need some sort of break. Okay, so that's what's happening. So the president and the presidential candidates are talking about this. Okay, so these are not ideas out of the blue all of a sudden. There is a context for this. And the context is privatization and the fact that there is a practical limit to privatization. You cannot privatize forever because eventually you run into the wall, and the wall is that people cannot afford to pay those prices anymore. And this country is now very close to reaching that wall. Not quite there yet, but close, okay? The history of the American universities, shows that this country always had a close connection between markets and higher education from the very beginning. 100 years ago, there were people already saying, complaining actually about this. Universities mimic business too much. They say universities are controlled by business too much. But it wasn't that bad, and it had some interesting aspects and so forth. In the course of the 20th century, that process continued to unfold, the marketization process, and then it accelerated tremendously in the last third of the 20th century under neoliberal theories, when higher education was conceptualized as a private good, not a public good anymore. Then you have people talking about the entrepreneurial university, academic capitalism, and so forth and so on. Okay, so this situation now is coming to a point in which people are demanding change. There have been student protests in several places, including here, and it looks like we are getting close to some limit here. Now, if we think about Chile, now Chile is a more extreme version of the United States, okay? That's why it's an interesting example. It's the most privatized country in the world with respect to higher education. It has the most expensive tuition with respect to income. This has become impossible for Chilean students and families. It's impossible. And there are very few fellowships. There are many problems, okay? So Chile has seen the biggest and most significant student protests in recent history in the world, actually. And these protests are still ongoing. So during the last presidential campaign, Bachelet promised free higher education. That was the platform that she ran on, and she won the election, and now she's the president, right? So now she's having to implement this, and of course this is not easy, and she's running into a lot of problems, as you can imagine. But nevertheless, she's trying to do something. She is doing something. It is a very significant development, and it is significant because one of the tenets of neoliberalism, or one of the ideas neoliberal thinkers and activists repeated, was that privatization was inevitable, that there was no alternative, right? You will hear this even from public university presidents and chancellors. They will say, well, the good old times are never coming back. the states are unreliable partners. We're never going to get any money from them. We have to go out there, we have to get money, etc., etc. And there was a lack of hope. It was like, it's privatization forever. And I think what's significant about all these developments is that they indicate that there is now hope, and people seem to want and expect change. Okay, so that's what we are going to look at, is the history of Chilean higher education, and we are going to begin in 1973. Well, in the history of higher education in Chile, there is a before and an after 1973. To be precise, September 11th, 1973. There was another famous September 11th, okay? And that was the day of the coup, when military dictator Pinochet took over, and he proceeded to privatize everything. And he privatized higher education in a most drastic way. So higher education in Chile changed completely. So that's why there is a before and an after, okay? The presentation is going to be to begin in 73. However, before we start with that conversation, I'd like to say a few things very quickly about before 73. As you know, Chile is a small country, fairly prosperous country. It had 8 universities that were created at the end of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th. Modern universities, there were colonial universities before, but modern universities. Those universities included 2 public universities and 6 private universities, mostly Catholic. They all offer higher education free of charge. They were subsidized completely, okay? So they were all free. Then they had regional branches, and eventually those became independent. So today that original group of 8 is 25 universities. And there is a matter of vocabulary I want to clarify here. We call those 25 universities the traditional universities, the universities that were in place before 1973, whether public or private, okay? To distinguish them from the new private universities that were created under Pinochet, which were mostly for profit, although in theory they couldn't be, but they were, okay? So that's the vocabulary. Traditional universities before 73, new private universities, these new enterprises. And with that, I will ask Liliana to take it from here.
Thanks, Cristina. It's great. It's a pleasure. It's a big pleasure to be here, and I would like to say thank you very much to university. I repeat, it's a pleasure to be here at the University of California here in Davis. Immediately after the coup, I must say that the military government took control of universities, and whose autonomy and influence it feared. Political appointees charged to severing all connections between the university and social replace rectors in that time. Collegial relations were replaced with a top-down bureaucratic system, and that neither faculty and non-students and that place were free to speak their minds. In fact, fearing for their lives, many of them were forced to leave the country. During this period, expenditures on higher education were drastically reduced, and student enrollments at public university decreased. In that time, after this period, forced reductions in enrollment, the military government took control and changed its policy to one of enrollment growth achieved through privatization. Okay. This took place as Chile moves sharply toward a liberal market system designed by neoliberals economists. Most were educated at the University of Chicago. Yeah, under Milton Friedman and his colleague Arnold Harberger, who has personal ties in Chile. The former Chilean students, the so-called Chicago boys, were able to take radical activities, and I mean economic measures unchallenged, and because Chile was a dictatorship, as all you know. One field in which this country's neoliberal experiment exceeded anything ever attempted in the United States was higher education, which was privatized by decree in 1980. Not coincidentally, the year in which Ronald Reagan, here in the United States, became president and launched his deregulatory revolution. As an extreme example of privatization in higher education, what happened in Chile should be of interest to all observers or to all kinds of observers in other countries. Indeed, Chile may be seen as a canary in the privatization coal mine. First of all, it is important to understand that, unlike other developed countries where public higher education has gradually lost funding over decades due to neglect, in Chile, it lost support by design. I mean, it's a really root of planning over the design. It happened all at once when the military government took place. The government decided to weaken existing universities that appointed Cristina and create competitive ones. I mean the new private universities, okay? After the military government, drastic cuts in financial support for higher education. All universities were forced to charge tuition fees and to seek other sources of funding, while encouraging students to take out loans. We thought that this was an extremely radical step at the time. Indeed, Chile was the first country in Latin America to charge tuition fees. Yep. In addition to limiting the growth of the existing 25 traditional universities, in that time, the government encouraged the creation of new private universities, entirely dependent on tuition fees, 100%, which were established all over the country and under permissive authorization rules. Most of these new private universities were politically very close to the military government. Even today, some of them are still connected to former members of the Pinochet dictatorship. The academic quality of many of the new institutions is poor. It's not high, really. They are very similar to for-profit universities in the United States. And it's very difficult to try to differentiate, to make a difference, because it's difficult to set which university is for profit and which is not, because they are all supposed to be non-profit. By law, universities in Chile cannot be money-making enterprise. But many of these new private universities distribute funds to investors or supporters by means of large payments for space, equipment, services, and administrative position and well-consulted jobs. There is a great deal of corruption nowadays. Many universities are being investigated for violation of their non-profit status. So, Cristina, back to you.
We are going to be alternating. Okay, so I'll continue for a little while here. Okay, so with the return of democracy to Chile in 1990, the system that was put in place by the dictatorship was not dismantled. On the contrary, it continued going full blast, okay? And it was a period in which there was tremendous growth in college enrollment. Chile went from an elite higher education system to a mass higher education system to a universal in a short period of time. In 1990, fewer than 15% of young people went to college. By 2012, the figure was over 50%, and today is much higher. Now, this sounds good, right? The problem was that many of these students went to those new private universities of inferior quality and very expensive. And another problem is that all universities were expensive. The new privates, the old privates, the publics, there was no inexpensive option. And Chile has very few fellowships compared to the US. So this was a tremendous burden for families. And it is a topic of conversation. If you go to Chile, you cannot be there for any period of time without running into people who talk about this all the time. I always like to talk to taxi drivers, and I had several taxi drivers tell me about their families. They were driving that taxi day and night, they were borrowing huge amounts of money, and in some cases they had to choose one child to send to college because they couldn't possibly send the others. Now we might think, okay, so it's good that taxi drivers can send children to college. There are countries where that doesn't happen. On the other hand, this is clearly a tremendous burden, and families are completely anguished about that. And then when those children finish those degrees, they find no jobs or they find inferior jobs, and then they feel cheated. This is where they are, enormous sacrifices for nothing. Then these families, in many cases, don't have a lot of cultural capital. If the parents didn't go to college, they are not able to make the distinction between a good university and a bad university. So they send a child to a university because it sounds good, and then they discover it wasn't any good at all. Advertising in Chile, I had never seen this before. If you are walking or driving around Santiago, there are many universities in Santiago, big and small, and many university buildings have like big flags, like vertical flags. They are advertising. And then you see big billboards on the highway. Instead of Coca-Cola or something like that, they will say university, blah, blah, blah. So it's very visual. There is a publicity war. I once saw a billboard about one of the traditional universities, and it said university, whatever, blah, 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 a real university. Now, all universities are competing, right? This is a highly privatized system, so they are trying to get students. And the traditional universities are sending the message that they are the good universities as opposed to these new operations. And so this is what's going on, but many families are not able to make that distinction. They see all this advertising, everything looks so great, and then they get a very nasty surprise at the end. Chile is one of the most unequal countries in the world, even though it's a prosperous country in Latin America, similar to, for instance, maybe Portugal or some of the smaller European countries. It has great inequality. And you will think that the fact that so many people go to college now will mean less inequality. But in fact, the opposite has happened. So there is more social stratification than ever before. It used to be that the distinction, it was to be or not to be a college student. But now it's to go to a good university or to go to a bad university. And there is enormous tracking. So now some people in Chile actually are talking about educational apartheid. That's the expression they use. This situation is what made the students demand a paradigm shift. The students wanted drastic changes, and then the student movements took place, okay? And Liliana is going to talk about the student protests now.
Yes. Since 2011, there have been a series of large and vociferous student protests across Chile. These have been broadly viewed as a reaction to the outcomes of the reform of the 90s, 80s. High tuition fees and pronounced social inequality. Chile, as Cristina says, is one of the most unequal countries in the world. Not only Chilean people said something about that, different studies and voices said something about that. The student movement of that time expressed deep and broad concern about Chilean society and the legitimacy of this political system. Although again a democracy, Chile still suffered from the ills of the Pinochet dictatorship, and whose radical neoliberal policies exacerbated social imbalances. It's important to say something about that following the reestablishment of a democratic government, these inequities were never truly addressed, let alone mitigated. In fact, they have been amplified by the forces of the global economy that are increasing inequality in countries around the world. So the case of Chile is very, very particular. Repression against the student movement brought back memories of the Pinochet era. Among the other actions, the government attempted to enact law criminalizing some of the students' activity. But their family, in this opportunity, their families, as well as many other citizens and other groups, were persuaded of the fairness demands and supported them. The Chilean student protests coincided with demonstrations by other groups around the world following the 2008 economic crisis, which produced severe dislocation and deep unhappiness in many places. The Arab Spring, the Spanish indignance, and the Occupy movement were part of the backdrop against this, the Chilean student protests took place. The 2010 Chilean earthquake energized college students. You know, Chile is a country that has a lot of earthquakes. So many of whom did volunteer work, building personal ties and a sense of community. In addition to the preparation afforded by these community service activities, students had the example of the 2006 Chilean high school student protest, known as a Penguin Revolution. I said penguin like after the colors of the school uniform to Chile. At the time, huge demonstration and strikes forced the government to promise to meet some student demands, which revolve around greater access to education for all social classes. That was the promise. This movement, spread all over the country and enjoyed strong support from the public. It is important to understand that the military government had changed not only the higher education system, but also the schools. This is a very sad theme, I said, because the schools were transforming according to neoliberal principles. So in one of the ways in which Chile experimented with Milton Friedman's ideas was by giving the vouchers for the students. So the students, in order to attend the schools, have to be that kind of choice. This was a bonanza for private schools, but it did not increase equality. In fact, poor students ended up attending public schools at higher rates than the students from more affluent families. So this is the reality, the actual situation, both to the universities, to the higher education system, and in the schools. Those neoliberal practices is present in both fields. I mean, and in the schools and in the higher education system. So, Cristina, could you? Thanks.
Okay, so now we are moving towards the conclusion, and for that we are going back to President Bachelet and President Obama. Okay, first President Bachelet. She won the election and then was faced with having to deliver on her promise to make higher education free of charge. That original promise was understood to mean in the traditional universities, not at the new private universities, and not all at once, and they always say it will be gradual, but they had ambitious plans. However, in the meantime, the economy went south, basically. They have some problems with it, so there was less money. Now there is less money, right? That's a problem. But an even bigger problem is political opposition to the reforms. Because after decades of privatization, there are a lot of vested interests. The owners of all the new private universities, the investors, people who might be at the traditional universities, but moonlight at the for-profits, at the new private universities. They teach, they consult, they are on boards. So many people are making money with the system that there is opposition to this. In the meantime, the students are still demanding free public education, higher education, and now they are getting more sophisticated in their demands because they have introduced a new thing in the discourse, and that is quality. So now the students are saying we want free higher education, and by the way, of high quality, okay? So she is under pressure from all sides, okay? So what is she doing? She's going ahead with a plan, is reduced with respect to her original plan, to offer free higher education to students whose families are in the bottom 50% of income in the country. Okay, so if your parents are in the bottom 50%, you get a tuition waiver. That's what has been announced. That doesn't sound bad, actually, but it's less good than it sounds. For one thing, the bottom 50% in Chile is pretty poor, okay? So these people don't have opportunities to send their children to good elementary schools, to good secondary schools, to the kinds of schools that will prepare them to go to good universities. So there is a lot of people who get lost in the pipeline there, right? And then some of these poor students had access to fellowships. Even though Chile has very few fellowships, it does have some. And some of these students were getting those. In spite of the things I'm saying, this proposal, which is moving ahead with, represents change and represents an improvement. People have been very skeptical about the whole thing, but we noticed that in the last few months, maybe even few weeks, when you read articles that are coming out, people are beginning to say, well, maybe this is modest, maybe this is just a first step, but we are moving in a different direction. So there is a feeling that this enormous higher education enterprise, imagine a big ship or boat, and that is beginning to turn slowly and painfully, but there is a change of trend, okay? So we think that's significant. Okay, and that's where they are now. Now, coming back to the US. As you know, in 2008, there was an economic crisis, the Great Depression. It was pretty deep. And this meant big budget cuts for public universities. This meant big tuition increases. And of course, the students were not happy about that. So there were student protests here in the US too, and most particularly at the University of California. And in fact, this campus was very much involved. We became famous or infamous with the pepper spray incident, which I don't have to explain again. But that was all part of the student protest against privatization. It is all the same pattern. And those protests, as you know, have continued, in fact, up to the present time. And the topic continues to be privatization, right? So there are parallels. Our case is not quite as acute as Chile's, but it's a very similar situation. When you look at the student protests and the topics that the students have focused on, you find great similarities. There are basically two topics. One is tuition, and that's the same in both countries, right? Everybody is upset about high tuition. In Chile, they are more ambitious. They are asking for free tuition, no tuition. Here, the students didn't quite ask for that, but they were asking for some sort of break, right? The high tuition was untenable. So that issue is identical in both sets of student protests. The second issue is profit. The Chilean students were saying things like no more profit in higher education, chanting that. They were mostly thinking about the new private universities that, as I said, they are fundamentally for profit. But also thinking about all those people, and some of them might be at the traditional universities, moonlighting for the others, who in one way or another are getting some financial advantage. They thought higher education shouldn't be a source, shouldn't be a money-making enterprise. Okay. Here in the United States, the profit theme is also there, but it takes a slightly different form. And that is the profit of the executives, executive compensation, right? So all the student protests have included an element of criticism about how much money the president makes, how much money the chancellor makes, etc. We have seen in the most recent series of protests that this got extended to other activities like service on boards or even for profit. So you can see how these two countries, they get closer and closer in the preoccupations of the students. So very similar concerns for the students because they are all reacting to the same situation. The difference is one of degree, and things are more acute in Chile than in the United States. So now, back to President Obama. When you look at the higher education enterprise in the US, it's an enormous enterprise, right? So many universities, thousands. And at the heart of the higher education enterprise, you have the big research universities like UC Davis, the big public research universities. Those continue to privatize as we speak. They are still privatizing. So the students are complaining about privatization over there, but the big research universities are privatized. Just to give an example of our own campus, which, by the way, is not new or unique or different from all the other campuses. In the last 5 or 6 years, there have been 2 initiatives on this campus. One for a new budget system, RCM, which is the kind of system the privates had, like Harvard, which basically makes schools and colleges kind of semi-independent, and then they have to go out there and make money. That is a typical technique of privatization, and many public universities are doing this. So we are doing what the others are doing. They are all privatizing. Another thing that we did in the last 5 or 6 years was to bring more international students because they pay very high tuition, and it's revenue source. Again, many public universities in this country are doing exactly the same thing. So you see the big public universities in the middle of this higher education enterprise still privatizing, okay? And the president looks at all this, and he's not addressing what's happening at the middle, right? He's not going there, he's not touching there, at least not yet. He's looking at the whole thing and trying to kind of begin to shrink the privatization behemoth at the edges from the outside in. So he is talking about the community colleges and free tuition for the community colleges on the one hand, and that's one of the edges of this enterprise. And the other is the for-profits, to put limits there. And that is where we are. That is where we are. So you see that there are many parallels between the two countries. They are facing the same issues. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens in each country. We believe that neither country will succeed without a strong commitment from key political players. The magnitude of the changes that are needed will require all the stars to be aligned. But if inequality and its discontents continue to increase, they soon might be. Thank you very much. Okay, so we can have questions, comments. Oh, okay.
Thank you so much for this really valuable and informative presentation today. But my question is more a clarification on something Liliana spoke of. I wasn't clear when she was talking about the neoliberalistic experimentations with the schools and the voucher systems. Was that something that they were also doing this experiment with giving the vouchers to K through 12, which then did not allow the students from the families from the lower socioeconomic status strata of Chile not to have access to the private schools? That's just a point of clarification on that. Or was those vouchers also a voucher system that were given to students to attend the university?
Okay, thank you for the question. Yeah, the reality is, by the 80s, the former regime create, or in other words, copy, right, the voucher systems, and every person in the Chile needs to be choose the school, but that choice is not really, because the school is located in the population or in the village that the student live, okay? And government take the voucher, and that money goes to the enterprise, because the school is a third case. I mean, the school is not public and is not entirely private. The school is a third type. And this third type, each student sits to class with the voucher, okay? And that activity was okay for the enterprises, because a different kind of entrepreneurial has that kind of activity. And in Chile, a lot of a lot of schools created at that time, okay? So the voucher is the amount of money for each student, but it's not related to quality. It's not related to the kind of the institution, okay?
But it's for post-high school schools.
Not on it. No, it's not for post. No, it's only for pre. Yeah, yeah, for to K-12. Yeah, this is the voucher for that kind of institutions for the schools. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. There's so many ways in which money making and profit making enter into these systems, but I'm curious, either one of you, is there the same issue of borrowing money to go to school? Certainly in the United States, we've had a long history of borrowing, but now that under certain political administrations, we don't have government-supported lower interest rates, this has become an enormous industry. And we don't have to go into all the details, but I'm curious, is the borrowing for going to college as prevalent in Chile as it is here?
Yes, it is now, and the banks have made a lot of money with that. And it is one of the topics of concern for many families that they owe too much money. So that's something that they certainly copied from the United States, but they carried it to extremes. With the student protest, they are now trying to respond to some of these things by lowering interest rates and amelioration techniques, but the fundamental situation is still the same.
Yes, and nowadays the students demand of kind of tuitions free of charge for all kind of students. But it's very interesting question because the interest rate was high in that period of time. I mean, 10 and 12 years ago, and the families has chose, like Cristina said, for instance, what child could go to university, and the interest rate was complicated, yeah, for the decision making in order to go to the schools, to universities. Mm-hmm.
Okay, looking at the attendance here, that should tell you about how much interest our campus has on this topic, right? You see, we have a big campus. You see how many people showed up? Now, the reality is that I blame the faculty as a whole. They are the ones who are supposed to be educated and should know what's best. But they don't take, they don't take an interest in the kind of decisions we need to make public education easily accessible. They take the lead of the administrators, which is capitalism and greed is good. Okay, socialism is bad. We should do everything we can to enlarge your pockets at any cost. So the faculty are the ones we should blame. And in some ways you can't blame them because they are afraid they are going to be retaliated against big time if they do something. So they are also freaking afraid that they are hiding behind their chairs. They don't have the courage to speak up. I mean, we really need people who, in a public institution, be free to talk about issues, discuss issues, without having to be afraid that you are going to be targeted. And unless we can stand up for the public education, we are doomed. There is no hope. We need to change. We really need an absolute revolution.
Okay, well, I think many faculty think that we need change, and some of them have expressed their views quite clearly. And by the way, the administration at American universities is, all of them, all the publics, is in a terrible situation because you are faced with the responsibility of having to manage a campus, and you don't get a lot of money from the state, and you have to somehow get money to keep things running. So it's not like administrators sometimes do this because they like it or because they want to. They are in a very difficult position. But you are right that one way to change things would be for more people to speak up, as you said, or to express their views in different fora and so forth and so on. But it's not an easy situation. We are all trapped in this privatization structure. And so I'm encouraged that we are beginning to see these signs in Chile and in the US, that people are beginning to believe that maybe it's possible to improve the situation, not to go back to the way, the good old times, as people say. You never go back exactly to the same place, but you know, it can be not a circle, but a spiral. We have to go back to a kind of situation that is more democratic, that offers more help for students. And, you know, in spite of all the things that we are saying, I personally feel optimistic that maybe there might be some changes. But, you know, we have to understand that universities are under tremendous stress. And to be an academic leader at a university, at a public university in America today, with the current situation, you have to be very brave, frankly. It's tough, okay, it's tough, because you have to pay the bills and you have to get the students on the door and do all these things. So it's not that easy, but as I said, I think there is hope now that the trend is beginning to change, that this enormous higher education ship is beginning to turn around. And I don't know what shape it's going to take. It's not going to be like the master plan in 1960. Nothing is ever the same as before. But there could be some sort of break given to universities from the states or the federal government or both to begin to ameliorate the situation. Well, you know, some university presidents make jokes. They say, okay, now we are all hiring out-of-state students to pay the bills. That's how we solve our problems. We just switch our students around and we pay the bills. But, you know, you cannot do that forever, right? It's what we said before. No trend is forever. Everything has a limit and a natural end point. And I think this trend is reaching the end. In Chile, it already has reached the end. We are getting close, but we are not quite there the way they are. But, you know, I'm sympathetic to the situation of administrators having to administer in that climate. My goodness, it's not easy. But do we need change? Yes.
My question is, given we can blame the administrators, we can blame the system, we can blame the faculty, but also I would also propose, how about we also blame the students and their families for, you know, maybe making a mistake in their investment. I mean, I know it sounds kind of messed up, but I think some blame should also go to the students and their families for deciding to go to a university or decide to study something that isn't entirely productive in terms of being able to pay the bills. So would you be able to comment on that?
Well, I don't know if I like blaming people. We can blame everybody. But I wouldn't blame the students and their families for wanting more education for, you know, for themselves or for their kids. This is the knowledge-based economy. I have a son. I made sure that he went to college and law school, etc., etc., etc. You want your children well prepared, and I want my students like you well prepared. So I will stay away from blaming groups and think about how all these groups maybe can come together to articulate some sort of solution. And I'm hopeful that maybe we are entering a new historical period now. And I don't know what form or shape this might take. but I'm confident that this will happen. I gave a presentation about this topic, not about Chile, but about privatization in the US a few years ago. And I also ended in a hopeful note, and back then it was much more difficult to be hopeful because we were still in the middle of privatization, and we had the president of the University of California saying the state is an unreliable partner and we have to forget about the state and go out there and get our own money and forget about them. I mean, this was the discourse at the time. My point was, well, you know, I don't care what people say, this cannot continue. It will not continue for the very simple reason that it cannot continue. When people cannot afford these things and they are going to be very unhappy, it will collapse. So now, a few years later, after that presentation, I feel like things are beginning to happen. So I wouldn't be too negative, but you do have to be proactive.
My question is related to this, actually, which is, it sounds like a lot of the problem is the quality of the education the students are paying for, and that they're being misled about the value of their education. And I wonder if there's a role for accreditation or quality control here, so that even if people do have to pay more than we wish, at least they're getting a very good education for that, that will help them succeed in life, you know, so that they don't feel cheated. Do you see that happening at all?
Yeah, thank you for the comment. Yeah, it's really in Chile. The reality about that thing is that the university must accredit it in order to receive the funds. But the question is, what happened with the accreditation? And what kind of organization could say something about the real quality about the institutions? And what kind of quality the university has in order to accredit or give a tier of quality about the teachers, about the research, about the good journals, and other things, about the facilities, about the resource and capabilities. So in Chile, the thing is going to change, we hope, in order to try to clarify by the different ways what is the real concern about accreditation. And besides, each university, we have, I would say, 2 or 3 levels of universities. The first level, we have complete university that has a good level of quality teaching and a really good level of the research and the services, and then they say the third mission, I mean. But we have 2 levels, and the 2 and 3 level is really different. So the accreditation must try to find the only way to differentiate or make a different point between one of them. Yeah.
Okay, about accreditation in Chile and here. Having done accreditation for some campuses, you know, WASC and all that, it's a low standard, okay? When somebody doesn't get accredited or doesn't get renewed, it's very bad, okay? So it's a low standard. Most of the for-profits in the US are accredited, and they are not that great. So in Chile, they have made a big effort about accreditation, which not all countries in Latin America do. So that's one of the things they did. And they are actually very rigorous about how many years you are accredited. If you have been accredited for 4 years, then you are entitled to this. So there are all these things. But keep in mind that that's a relatively modest level of accomplishment. So just to say that they are accredited, you know, it's not saying much.
In the current system, but is this an area for improvement? You know, so create a different quality control system for universities.
Yeah, in the last speech of President Bachelet say something about the make an improvement of the system of accreditation in that country, and faculty stay alert about that and really hope it may change or try to change or make an improvement about that. But it's really important that you say the standard is low, and I will say something about the type of the kind of level and the items that people try to follow for that reach the level, right?
Oh, I have a funny thing to add. I don't know if it's funny, but there were some new private universities that got accredited in the US, but not in Chile. And so they were getting accredited in the US and then going back and telling people, we are accredited by the same group that accredited Harvard and Yale. So,
It's like marketing.
so accreditation, it's a new thing, relatively new. Everybody thinks this is like some magic thing, and they are attaching too much meaning to it, and sometimes doing things that are a little funny.
That happened in Wall Street too. Yeah.
I'm interested in the issue of government control over universities. So it sounds like the new private universities in Chile were still subject to some political controls, even though there might have been very little money flowing to them. In the United States, of course, universities are often complaining about government regulations and all the things we have to do to respond to requests for information and follow all sorts of rules and on and on and on. And at the public universities in particular, of course, as states have withdrawn support, that fraction has gone down and down, people have asked, well, at what point does the state still have anything to say about the university? And there have been some notable attempts to circumvent that and come to an agreement that the public university says, okay, if you reduce our funding, that's fine, but you can't tell us what to do anymore. So I guess what I'm asking is, would you be willing to speculate on what might happen if universities were made free, that is to say, governments funded all tuition? What do you imagine the level of control and authority over public universities in particular, or even private ones, might be in that perhaps distant future?
Historically, in this country, our period of biggest freedom was when we were getting a lot of money from the state. They gave us the money and left us alone. Okay. As they started to give us less and less money, they became more and more, they started to interfere, right? And to give you a few dollars and then determine how you use those dollars and watch you like a hawk and so forth and so on. So, in fact, some university presidents make jokes about, they say, we went from having state-supported universities to having state-located universities. And one of the presidents, whose name I won't reveal, went one step beyond that, and now he was talking about state-molested universities. So talking about the fact that the less money they give you, the more they interfere, the more difficult they are, the more controls they have. I think if they were to give you a lot of money, quite frankly, they probably interfere less. But now they have to do something to show that they are doing something. And since they are not giving you money, they are showing their zeal by interfering. So I don't know. I don't know what will happen, but I'm just doing like reverse engineering here. You are an engineer.
Can you go back?
Let me just ask a question on the last issue, which is obviously a very difficult issue. My understanding is that the principal problem in Chile with government support for the private universities comes through the fellowships to students, or the scholarships to students, or I should say really the loans to students. It's where, the same as I think here with University of Phoenix, you request a government loan. If you get it, you then use that to pay your university fees. And at the end of the time, if you haven't graduated, or maybe you've even graduated but you don't have skills that are of any value, you have a debt that you have to pay, and a not very great capacity to pay it. I think that's a different type of of certification in some senses, or accreditation, because you're accrediting not the university, you're determining whether the university is really producing value to the students that you're financing to go there, but who owe you, who have to repay you if they don't. And I'm not sure how that problem, I mean, here, my very limited understanding is that we've just denied, I think it was, which one was it, Concordia, I think this last year, from being able to get access to government funding for students, and they went bankrupt immediately. And I presume that's a similar sort of thing that could take place in Chile. Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Jarvis. Yeah, in Chile happened what kind of situation about the quality. We have two levels of certification. The first level, as you said, is give about the first 1 or 2 years of existence of the university. So it's very funny because different professors, especially Professor Himmel at the Catholic University, says that the university receives the license to kill. Okay, yeah, it's very tough, right? Because it's licensed to kill in order to try to almost sell the certifications and activities. This is the first, the certification. And then after the first stage, the university could go to the accreditations. And we have two levels of minus accreditation. It's about teaching, it's about management. And then we have different levels for try to differentiate the university. I mean, research accreditation, the accreditation about another activities of services, like a third mission. But it's very special case because the first level is low. It's very low, it's very easy to access. Okay, so the license to kill is very complicated. Okay.
Any other questions? If not, thank you very much, Cristina and Liliana.